Okay. So Noah asked me to talk about my work attempting to operationalize the field of philosophy known as rhetoric. And I realized that I wasn't sure if this was an area that everyone in the room would be familiar with, so I thought it might be useful to do a sort of very short, possibly unnecessary and completely insufficient history of rhetoric, just to make sure we're all on the same page of what I mean when I say rhetoric. I think this is actually part of the issue that we were just experiencing. Is Nick was saying, "Oh, I'm operationalizing narratology," and what does that mean? Where are we starting from? We're trying to take a domain of knowledge that has been expressed outside of the computer and make it work computationally. What does that mean? What does that mean to do? Well, one way to answer that is to begin answering the question of what it is. And unfortunately, the rhetoric, usually when you think of this word rhetoric, it's very negative these days. So you think of like lying politicians, who have the rhetoric of Mitt Romney or whatever, or just in general the idea of smoke screening. But if we go, way back in history, then what the word rhetoric comes from is oration, oratory. Rhetoric is the practice of public speech, of public speaking, which was largely used in the ancient world in civic functions. So, the public forum, the court of law, it was always oral, it was always public, and this practice, which is very unique to ancient Greece in some ways, kind of prompted its own like cottage industry, sort of like self-help industry. Which is sometimes referred to as technical rhetoric, like how do you speak in public if you have to, because you might have to defend yourself in court or make your case in the public fora, and there eventually were these kind of trainers, like personal trainer for rhetoric, and they were called sophists, to teach rhetorical technique. This is sometimes referred to as sophistic rhetoric, and it's the kind of rhetoric that Socrates despised and considered a form of flattery, just trying to tell somebody what they want to hear. And so, up through Plato, rhetoric has a kind of negative connotation, and then Aristotle rescues rhetoric as a kind of philosophical activity, which he defines as persuasion toward correct judgment. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and because Aristotle's not an enemy to the medievals like he is to those of us. Most of us today, which is too bad. But the idea of Aristotelian rhetoric made its way into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance as a way of describing other modes of inscription beyond just speech, particularly since writing became more common. And because writing doesn't necessarily make the same kind of direct appeal as oratory, where I would be trying to convince you of something like I'm trying to do right now. Instead, writing does something different, and so rhetoric began to gain a new, more general meaning, that of effective expression. And then again, I'm skipping a lot. After a kind of quiet revisionary period during the Enlightenment and through the modern era, rhetoric enjoyed a revival starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which also saw some new ideas and kind of an expansion of the term. Probably the best known thinker of this era is Kenneth Burke, whose notion of rhetoric was much more medium agnostic, that rhetoric in Burke's mind is a kind of identification. And when you make a general definition like that, it's really great for citation counts, right? And you can apply it to anything. Burke's definition massively broadened the scope of rhetoric from overt strategic political persuasion to more implicit tactics, like the identification found in any kind of media experience, really. And of course, at the same time in the 20th century, we have a massive explosion of different kinds of media and the desire to understand how other sorts of inscription, not just writing and speech, operate, photography, cinematic expression, and so forth. And so there was born, visual rhetorics, the study of visual rhetoric. And then if you fast forward toward the end of the 20th century, start of the 21st, as computation started to come online as an expressive practice, and then we saw a term like digital rhetoric emerge, again, kind of following the Burkean tradition, in which inscriptive modes that were slightly different than traditional writing and speech and images like websites or wikis or blogs were studied. And that brings us to kind of my intervention, or my attempt at an intervention, which is just to say that those are all well and good and we can have them and that's nice, but all of those accounts of rhetoric are insufficient to embrace the particular mode of inscription that the computer offers us, which is a procedural mode. And if we think about procedurality as the thing that is fundamental to computers, which we could argue about, but let's not for right now, take my word for it, then there would be a kind of procedural rhetoric, a rhetoric that, like visual rhetoric addresses images, procedural rhetoric would address processes, claims or ideas that are expressed with process instead of with speech or with writing or with images or with moving images or with combinations of those media. So procedural rhetoric is a kind of model building. You're trying to express an idea or make an argument by building a model of some kind, and then someone comes along and they mess around with that model and they say, oh, okay, I see your argument about how this thing works or could work or might work differently. So that's the argument that I made in persuasive games. So there's a question we could ask, so who cares about that? Like, why would we can have an academic argument about why it would be useful to define new modes of operationalizing old things, and it might be worth doing just for that sake. But also there are applications for new modes of practice, and the thing about procedural rhetoric that seems interesting and appealing to me is that the world is sort of full of these weird, intractable, complex systems and problems that we seem not to be able to get our heads around using the media that we have traditionally used, especially writing and speech and images and moving images, which are still the forms that dominate the way that we converse with one another. And I should stop here to say, as an aside, that in some more recent work, I've argued that procedural rhetoric is not necessarily solely a computational kind of rhetoric. Like you could build models in other media too, but computers happen to be intrinsically model-building machines. Anyway, what I thought I would do is, now that I've given you a little bit of a summary, show you some examples that I thought were particularly good uses of procedural rhetoric. And I'll give you two stories that I tell in persuasive games, which I know many of you have heard these for years, and good stories never get old, right? And then I'll show you a few examples of games that I've made that for better or worse, attempt to take this procedural rhetoric design technique seriously. And I organize these by subject matter, to try to connect them to the kind of weird, intractable problem space sort of thing that I'm claiming becomes more accessible through this operationalization of rhetoric in computational form. This is one that starts the book, an example around institutional politics. So there was an old educational computing system of the 60s and 70s called the Plato, which looked like this, way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And there were many games written for it, games in educational applications, this planetarium model. I don't actually have a screenshot of the game that I wanted to mention running. That it was a game called Tenure, which is a subject near and dear to all of our hearts. And in this case, what it was about was high school teaching, being a first-year kind of new green high school teacher, and would have been used in the context of an educational a program in education, right? So if you imagine yourself in that context using this game, and it was all about the institutional politics of the workplace, of the secondary education workplace. So you're a young, eager would-be teacher finishing your degree and your certification, and you think you're going to go into the classroom and everything is just going to be all about your students and the material. And this game tries to present all of the wrinkles, all of the problems that get thrown in. So you have to interview for your job, and you don't know what the principal is thinking, and you're presented with these multiple choice questions basically, and you have to kind of guess, well, is this what she wants me to say or not? And you never really know, but you get the job or you don't, and then you're thrown into the classroom and asked to organize it. You want to put your students in alphabetical order, or just let them do whatever you want. And each of these have an implication on the way that the students and your fellow faculty perceive you. So the example that I discuss in the book through a playthrough of the game that I ran with a port that the original creator made many years later, I had this student who was always late to class, and well, do you approach the student? Oh, and of course, I'm an empathetic teacher, so I'll approach the student and talk to him about it. And he says, oh, I'm so glad you asked. It's Mr. Green, the math teacher, who's keeping me after class. And it's all the way across campus, and I just can't get here in time. So, is there anything you can do? And now you're presented with this problem you didn't know you had before, which is that Mr. Green is a much more senior a teacher than you, and you're going to have to deal with like the personality conflicts later, and there's a faculty lounge and everything. And so you have to kind of deal with these checks and balances, and there's not really ever a good answer. But that's not really the point. The point is, here are the dynamics of the workplace, and understanding those dynamics and the way that the feeling of working through those conflicts is something that as a new teacher would benefit you, right? Okay, so that's one example. This is my favorite example ever, which is Animal Crossing is this silly game for Nintendo, which is actually about long-term debt, or at least partly about long-term debt. So this is a game for kids that I used to play a lot with my kids, and the only video game my wife has ever played, really. You run away from home, and you go to this town called Animal Crossing, and there are these cute animals, and you're the only human, and you get to live in this great town, and that's the whole game. But one of the weird things about the game is that you start with nothing. You have nothing, and so mercifully, you are given the opportunity to work your way up, and Tom Nook, who is the local real estate tycoon, shopkeeper, slumlord. He gives you a house, and then you have to start working for him. So it's this very strange game in which you buy the game for like $50 for your 8-year-old or whatever, and you take it home and you put it in the Nintendo, and you boot it up, and the first thing that happens is you get a mortgage that you have to work off. And the way that you play the game is, you can fish, or you can collect insects and sell them to Tom Nook in his shop, and he'll give you money for them, and you can use that money to pay off your mortgage, and eventually if you pay it off, he'll do like an addition. You can see the second floor of the house and all this. And there's all sorts of other little things you can do in this kind of idyllic environment. But the experience I had with my son playing this game was I think a wonderful example of how procedural rhetoric works when it works at its best. So you can collect different objects, and you can buy stuff to customize your house, and shirts and furniture and that kind of thing. So I got home one day from work. My kid was 5, and he'd been playing this game a lot. And he told me that he had a problem that he wanted to talk with me about. And this was the first time that it really happened with my son. So I was very kind of chuffed to be having this paternal moment. Well, tell me what's wrong, son. And he said, okay, well, I have so much stuff in my house. I have the pear couch and the space station and all those shirts I made. I've got so much stuff in my house, I can't even walk around in my house. And I realized at this point that he was talking about Animal Crossing. So he said, I need more space. I need a bigger house to hold my stuff. I said, all right, okay. And he said, but the problem is that I spent all my money on the stuff that I bought to put in my house, so I don't have any money left to pay my mortgage. So what do I do, Dad? And I was like, all right. And in a very real way, this is a more sophisticated conversation about long-term debt than most adults have had, right? And so we sat down and we talked about. He was when he found out about interest, that there was no interest on the loans in Animal Crossing. Mercifully, he was horrified, right? So that's another example. And then just really quickly a few examples of me trying to take procedural rhetoric as a design philosophy in my game development practice. And this is hard because I'll get to that. But so one topic that I've worked on is obesity. In all of the public and private efforts, I think, to change our behavior toward nutrition and exercise, and to encourage moderation and food planning and physical activity, everything is discussed around the concept of self-control and choices, rather than presented in a way that shows something wrong with my slide there. That shows the endemic. Systematic, complicated scenarios that are actually, there we go, responsible for this supposed crisis in. So at the studio, we made this game that the independent television service funded called Fat World, which is supposed to take seriously the idea of the politics of nutrition and look at the relationships between obesity and nutrition and socioeconomics in the contemporary U.S. specifically. And you would have this game where you'd make a character with a physical appearance, but also with these different health properties and medical predispositions and all sorts of stuff. And it was kind of like Animal Crossing, actually. You get thrown into this little simulated world, but there's social class and there's income, and that has an impact on the choices you make. And you've got to do meal planning and buy the food that you would eat, but you can only afford that if you're making enough money to do so. And there's food subsidies that change the dynamics of nutrition, and you can control those through healthcare policy and other kinds of governmental interventions, and you can get information about the state of your character's health if you can afford it, or if you have subsidized public health, which you can also kind of you live in this little community with other people, and there's sort of a rudimentary voting system and so forth. So really simple condensed version, or an attempt at it, of a way of showing the interactions between all of those different factors in dealing with this issue. Okay, so 2 more quick examples. Franchise economics. So there's this ice cream store called Cold Stone Creamery that we did some consulting for at the studio, which is interesting in that they mix the ice cream flavors for you on this cold slab, which is cool because you get exactly what you want, but it's difficult for the business because they're not pre-measuring servings of their product. And in many food service businesses, including this one, profits are really closely tied to the cost of particular ingredients. And because of their unique serving method, ensuring consistent serving amounts and therefore stabilizing profits is quite difficult. By the way, at Taco Bell, the profit is all in the cheese. Interesting fact. So this is a game we made for the Cold Stone employees that tries to simulate the process of serving ice cream at the correct sizes. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not just the customers pressuring you or remembering the ingredients or whatever, but also the individual kind of feel and viscosity of different ice creams, which pull differently. And so there's an ice cream physics simulation in the game, but then there's also the social physics, if you want, of the interactions that you have with customers. But then on top of that, a kind of contextualization of the impact of the line worker in a store like this, which shows you some representation of the economics of the franchise to give the, and these are high school, college kids mostly who work at these kinds of places, a sense of the economic context of the rationale behind asking employees to do this work in the first place. And when we made this game, I went and I did all the Cold Stone training stuff, and they had these horrible videos of the guy with the perfect teeth, doing everything right every time, and it's presented in this context-free way that doesn't help you understand why it matters in the first place. This is a more surgical example. And then one more example, which is a game we did that the New York Times published a number of years ago about the then hotly debated McCain-Kennedy immigration bill, which had this so-called points-based green card award system. And it was an interesting example because it was discussed in such a poor fashion in the press. And by poor fashion, I mean that they just copied and pasted the Kennedy office's press release example of how this system would work. And this struck us as exactly the kind of thing we could operationalize in a video game. So we just took the calculus of the points-based green card award system and turned it into this little game where you try to build an immigrant who, under the proposed legislation, is just slightly better than the one that's been presented opposite. So it's kind of a weird game to play, but if you played this game for 5 or 10 minutes, you would see many, many, many more runs of the kind of immigration situation that would be preferred by the legislation than you would have if you just read a report or a story about the bill. Okay, so that's that. Noah asked us to say a little bit about things we would like to see happen. So things I would like to see include robot lions that assemble into a large humanoid robot. I guess the general summary I would give of things I'd like to see is, a true earnest engagement with the complex topics that exist in the world. And it's easy to pick politics and those things are complex, but even just serving ice cream is complex. Anything is kind of really complex. But we tend to distill and simplify things down nowadays to their simplest kind of possible representation, right? And you don't really ever want to do anything or engage with anything whatsoever but instead it's like we're just we've taken for granted that the internet is solving all of our problems, and just look on the internet and yay, everything will be great, and then we'll give a TED talk about it, and I think that this is like a completely stupid world, and I think that games have been implicated in this logic, this kind of internet logic, right, in which the questions we ask are too simple. They are not true to the potential to embrace complexity that procedural rhetoric seems to embrace. So when I see, a headline like this, "Can games change the world?" I just want to vomit. And instead what I want to see are examples, more examples. The ones that I've shown you, some of them were horrible failures, and some of them were modest successes. But certainly, this has not been a successful project, culturally speaking, right? What I'm presenting to you is still largely theory. And that's annoying. I would like it to be less theory and more reality. So that's that. Thanks. Yes.
The skill set required to engage in more traditional word and prose-oriented rhetoric is well understood and has been for a long time. What do you see are the maybe educational obstacles to a world in which someone who wants to engage in procedural rhetoric, we can expect that, say, a citizen could have those skills?
Yeah, right. That's a good question. I guess that, the way that I was sort of depicting the media conversations that we have about topics important or not are also endemic in our educational conversations. So, school just started, and my son got his chemistry book, and it starts with, why study chemistry? And everything that we present to ourselves, whether we're young or old, it assumes that the best way to communicate is the simplest way, I think. And so, when you run into a situation like the one my then 5-year-old son did, which is authentic, that's not the norm. So I think the literacy issue, which we sometimes discuss in terms of being able to do symbol manipulation with computers, and the ability to program is sometimes argued for as a way into thinking systemically. This goes back to A.G. Perlis, and this is many, many decades old. That's all, that might be true, but we really need that kind of that discourse of complexity everywhere in order for it to be tolerable, and for you even to think, well, if I were going to say something about a subject like operationalizing rhetoric, how would I go about it in a way that gave credence to the challenges and kind of push and pull that are associated with it, rather than doing this is why I think the kind of nonfiction trade book TED Talk culture is so damaging. That's exactly the same thing as the simple answer on Fox News. It's just that it's presented in a way that's supposed to be intellectualized. I don't know if I've answered your question exactly, but I guess that would be, we live in a culture of simplicity. And so, the way to develop the literacies that would then be expressible computationally, which is itself hard, would be to somehow short-circuit the culture of simplicity.
So I actually had something else, which is your 5-year-old had this revelation because of Animal Crossing. And so there was a real genuine moment of receiving understanding from a procedural rhetoric, and yet the makers of Animal Crossing kind of backed into that accidentally.
Well, I have no idea. I mean, we really can't know. And one of the things that often comes up in discussion of rhetoric in general and procedural rhetoric in particular is, is intentionality required or not? And these are complicated topics. But I look at a text like that, a work like that, as a whole. That is doing what it's doing purposely. And certainly, I don't think he's the only 5-year-old or only kid who would have encountered that. But certainly that way of using Animal Crossing is probably somewhat unusual. But what would we be tempted to do? Go and write like a 40-minute, 5th grade curriculum for it? That seems idiotic too. So how would we develop? How would we even know that took place? Like unless I played video games with my son, and he knew that we could talk about Animal Crossing, that moment would have just vanished, would have evaporated.
You envision a day when media, like you go to whatever's the online equivalent of your newspaper or whatever, your editorial, and they're trying to get something across to you, so the person creates a procedural intervention to demonstrate to you directly this.
Right. That's the kind of thing that I would like to think about, that I would like to see more of. But the problem with it is that it becomes so difficult to do new work inside of old institutions. So I've done a lot of work with journalism, and Michael and I have been working on this news game generator, and I did a book with my PhD students a couple of years ago called News Games, about games and journalism. And we tell some of the stories of my experience working with the New York Times and CNN and other companies, where the idea of presenting complex information in a simulated form is appealing, but the reality is just that we're sort of so stuck in the old paradigm of media that doing anything different is impossible, organizationally impossible, not rhetorically impossible, certainly not technically impossible. I don't know who was next. Have you been watching?
I
Noah?
haven't. You're going to have to choose.
Okay, I'll. I think Janet was next then at the end.
So I'm going to channel the other Janet for a moment. I'm trying to figure out how to ask my question in exactly the right way. And Janet said in her talk that something about our job, I don't know exactly how she said it, our job is to ask the long-term questions and model lasting solutions. So is that what you said? Our job is to do that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I hear your long-term question. Okay. How can we? You said I really want honest engagement with the complexity of issues. Even serving ice cream has complexity. Okay. And you showed us an example to help people experience that. Okay. Where's your focus on the actual learning from that experience, and why are you focusing primarily on the rhetoric, which is sort of the having the experience, right, and not also focusing on the promoting learning from it?
Well, I mean,
I agree that your son, had this amazing experience and whatever, but not everybody who has that experience with the game is going to have that, is going to learn like
Sure,
that.
yeah, right.
Most of them are going to walk away.
right, yeah. So my favorite answer to this question is David Schaefer's, and he sets up these experiments, which are much more manual than the computational examples. It says, okay, to talk about a subject, waste management is one of he's built these sort of tabletop games around issues like this. Have a conversation about waste management. Go ahead, and he does this with middle school age kids. And what do they have to say about waste management? I don't know. Like the garbage comes and it goes away, and it's out of my hands. And then they interact with a system, a design system that has been built to portray some portion of that system, and then they talk about it again, right? And this is just one example of a way of demonstrating a difference in discourse. But I'm not a learning scientist, so I don't consider that part of my specific project. But I think there's lots of other stuff that's already going on that's addressing your question. The problem I see is more institutional than it is one of metrics or outcomes.
Janet would say, don't worry about the institutional part of it, because our job is to model.
I love this moment.
Because our job is to model lasting solutions. Okay, so she would say, don't worry about that part. So I want to know what. I love these. I'm not criticizing. I love these. Okay, I just want you to know. But I want to know what you're adding to all that other stuff.
All other stuff.
The other stuff you say that's out there. Okay, there's all this. There are these games out there. What are you adding? What are you adding to that by calling this procedural rhetoric?
Well, that's a theory, right? It's a theory or a design philosophy. It's a way of making things, a way of thinking about the process of translating systems in the world into representations of those systems in the computer.
But does it tell you what they need to experience in the system?
Oh, of course not. It gives you a framework through which to ask questions about what a particular situation might demand. But there's a million ways of making the ice cream game or the long-term debt game, right? And those questions, I don't think it answers. It's almost like the application of the argument to the design process itself. Design doesn't get turned into a a black box where you crank the knob and it performs the action.
I understand what I know by calling it procedural rhetoric in terms of how to build one of these that I didn't know before as a learning scientist.
Oh, I can't answer that question for you. I mean,
No, you
I
have to answer that question for me. That's what we're doing in this interdisciplinary world of, talking to each other. I mean, I'm not trying to be negative, I'm trying to understand.
you're absolutely trying to be negative. Come on.